All right, welcome to week 9. Really, for the most part, the last week. We're on the final chapter, chapter 11, and we're going to be talking about fleet risk management tonight. And this is, I've told others, this is actually probably one of my favorite chapters to go over, and I wish they would actually, at least in the book, maybe do it earlier. And part of the reason why is it really talks more about a systems approach, or thinking as a fleet as a system. And I'm one of those that I'm if you want to call it systems thinking or systems theory. There's a book in 54 I talked about with the fifth discipline, or Peter Senge. And there's the idea that everything really operates within a system. If you think of things that way, it makes it a little easier. You can kind of understand how if you kind of pull one thing, how that has an effect on another piece of the part. And really, you just can't think of from a safety standpoint of just that. If we just fix that one thing, you got to think of what the downstream effects are, or if you think of the total package of what the product is. And I usually give the example. And speaking of fleet, if you think about a car, what makes a car a vehicle when we think about it? Well, or what's the essential components? If we take out the windshield wipers, it's still a car. If we take out certain other components, it still might be a car. But okay, if we have a problem with the engine, it can't operate. If we there's certain components that we might be able to tweak a little bit or take out, and it'll still operate from a system standpoint. But there's some core elements that maybe will make it not run as well, or maybe it will make it have problems down the road and things like that. So as we talk about the systems piece of it tonight, I think that it'll make more sense, because when you start thinking about this, you'll probably see applications of how you might apply it in other areas, not just in the fleet area. And I think that'll also give you some better context. So the good news is this chapter is only about 28 pages, so a little bit shorter than some of the others. And so the objectives are a little bit shorter as well. And so we're going to talk about, explain how fleets can be viewed as systems and the implications for fleet loss control. Explain how the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations apply to motor vehicle fleets. Explain how to control losses associated with the components of the motor fleet safety system. And then finally describe some of the technological advances in motor vehicle fleet safety. When we talk about fleets, a lot of times people think, okay, it's got to be like a trucking fleet. Well, not necessarily. You can have, if you're in a public works department, you have a fleet of vehicles. If you're in a utility, PG&E, they have a fleet of vehicles. Every operation typically has a fleet of some type. And then sometimes you make the decision of whether you want to have a fleet to be able to have to worry about that risk. So an example I would give, with Raley's is you had a lot of people that would have to go out to the stores. Well, they have to make a decision. Are they going to have a fleet pool or a pool of vehicles available, or are they going to say, you're going to drive your own vehicle, and you have to maintain insurance, and you're going to get reimbursed a certain amount, and which basically may have the same effect. But the problem is when people drive their own vehicles, it also increases the exposure potentially for the organization. If the vehicles aren't maintained properly and something happens, the corporation may be on the hook because of what type of insurance they have and when they're driving those vehicles. So, and then the other piece of it, which is a little unusual, but I'll just bring it up, is where I got in a debate with a city of if you allow people to use their own vehicles. Well, one location, the person wanted to ride their motorcycle to all their locations. Well, there's an increased risk of driving a motorcycle. And so do you then have a policy that excludes employees from driving motorcycles on organizations or company business? So anyway, just some little things, little tidbits that have to be thought of there. So now going right into it, so when we start thinking of fleets as systems, the idea of, and this really goes not just with fleets, but it can be any type of environment, and that's why I like this chapter, is it's usually going to have 4 common characteristics. There's going to be components and what the purpose of those components are. So, components are we'll talk more about specifically, of that. The environment in which the system operates. So we'll be talking about the legal environment, that there's the physical environment, there's all the, other type of environments that have to be considered. Then there's the life cycle aspect of, just with when you decide that you're going to purchase a vehicle, you also have to keep in at the end of, okay, how long is the vehicle going to last? How are you going to dispose of the vehicle at the end of life? How are you going to maintain the vehicle? So you have to think of all those things that are part of it. And if you think of, okay, well, hazardous waste, or if you think of the life cycle approach to a building, that there's operational costs, there's all these things. The building's going to, in this case, will probably last 100 years. But that means whatever you built in the beginning, you're going to have to live with for the next 100 years, because you're not going to do remodels, or maybe not significant remodels. So if you don't build safety into the design process, you're going to suffer operationally. You're going to have to do more administrative and other type of controls, personal protective equipment type things as well. And then lastly, the systems relationships. How does all these things really interact when you start, putting all the pieces together? So the system safety rests on the premise that a system will operate safely if its components enable it to fulfill its purpose within its environment without any system components failing throughout its life cycle. So again, as long as we don't have a failure, it's really putting all those things into place. And when we think about from a systems approach, the systems approach is used with NASA, with the space shuttles, all those types. They think about all the different pieces, when it lifts off, all those things. So hopefully you'll start getting the context of the big picture, because I think it will really help you not only in this, from a test taking standpoint, but just in other aspects. So we talked specifically about components and purpose. When we think of components purpose from a fleet standpoint, there's a couple of things we're looking at. The vehicle, obviously. We're going to look at vehicle maintenance, operators, cargoes, the routes that they're going to take, and also the vehicle schedules. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit about Southwest as part of the good examples, but if you think it's not a vehicle, but if you think of the same thing, the aircraft maintenance, who's going to fly those aircraft, the cargoes, what are they going to carry, so the seat capacity, what routes are they going to make, are the planes going to fly, what routes can they not fly? They can't fly longer haul routes possibly based upon the type of aircraft they're purchasing. So they bought a certain aircraft that's more flexible to allow them to be able to do different things. If they decide that they're going to start flying to Hawaii, do they need a different type of aircraft? That might be part of it. And then also the scheduling of how do you make sure the schedule operates. So sometimes it's almost easier to kind of use that as an example, and you'll see where I think Southwest has done a great job when you start thinking from a systems approach of what they've done. They've made life very simple by just having one type of aircraft rather than having like United and having 8 different aircraft, different type of maintenance. You have not all the pilots can fly each type of plane, so you have complexity within that system that you don't necessarily see with Southwest. Then we talk about components of purpose. Especially from a fleet standpoint, the central purpose of any fleet system, the goal is to transport either cargo or people. It's either to move, even if we're trying to get to a location to provide some type of service, the main goal is we're trying to get people or cargo to one place to another. Now, I think the characteristics of what makes a good operational fleet would be one that's reliable, so vehicles aren't breaking down. The vehicles are safe and well maintained, that we have that. They're efficient, both from maybe a fuel economy standpoint. They're not going to be costly to operate. What we're doing is lawful, that they follow the ARB, Air Resources Board requirements, that they, the modifications on meet those requirements. And then hopefully they're environmentally neutral as well, that they're not going to cause, they're going to be more sustainable from that standpoint.
The role of GPS in systems now to capture that kind of information, like life cycles and routes and gas fuel, the amount of fuel you use is a big part now.
Yeah, and we'll talk about, so as far as like technology, and that's one thing we'll touch on the end. So part of my background that also might be helpful to kind of the context of where I approach it. When I worked with my prior employer with Bickmore, one of the accounts that I was the risk control manager for was CalTIP, which is California Transit Insurance Pool, and consisted of about 35 smaller to medium-sized transit agencies, so mainly bus fleets. And so the technology that's out there is with that, and then prior to that, working with Raley's, I was with the distribution center. So we also had bus fleet, not bus fleets. We had, big rigs, essentially tractor trailers. And so there's that fleet operation as well. Now you're going up to the mountains, you're hauling all the way to Elko, Nevada. You have hours of service, so all those type of things. So the good news, I kind of got to live a little bit this. It's not just a textbook experience with that. And of course, with the university, we have a lot of drivers. And my bigger issue that we'll talk more about is really driver selection and having policies and how that plays a role when you think of fleets as a system. So going on to the environment, when we, as part of one of the elements, we talked about components and purpose. Now we're going to look at the environment. System environments include physical, legal, economic, and competitive aspects. So the physical environment, when we think about it, that's going to be our highways. It could be weather conditions that we're going to have to deal with. Also, the physical environment's routes, tangible objects, and forces the vehicle encounters. So the physical environment, you have to consider what type of vehicle you're going to purchase based upon this. So if I know I'm going to have to make long hauls in the mountain, I need to now probably have to have some vehicle that's going to be, handle the snow. Also, you have to consider there's certain types of, like buses, they have automatic snow chains, I think, where basically they kind of throw out and it just throws out the chains in front, so you don't even have to chain up. So there's technologies out there that can help with that, some of those things. So, or if some of the examples they give in the book, if I'm going to be doing long hauls and it's refrigerated cargo and I'm going to be going through Death Valley, you're going to want to make sure that the refrigeration system's adequate to be able to handle such a long haul. The legal environment, laws, both written statutes enforced by police and officials in court, to understand. That can be the Air Resources Board requirements, those type of things, smog checks. The economic environment, fleet safety is supported by adequate budget during good times and conversely suffers when bad times cause budget constraints. And one of the big things that I see, especially with fleet operations, is that purchases are made, but there's not the idea of the replacement schedule for that vehicle at some point. That has to be part of the consideration, and that's where the economic environment has to be part of that. Is there a means to even set up a replacement schedule? You just say, oh, we need to buy a new bus, and hopefully we have the money to buy that, or do we going to use safety funds to make that happen? And then also there's the competitive environment. So when an organization operates in a normal competitive environment, fleet safety is more likely to receive the emphasis and the financial and managerial support it deserves. If there's not as much competition, the fleet safety efforts and expenditures can be lowered, to try to save money. And the idea is looking at it from if you're competing against, maybe let's use taxis as an example. Okay, how often are you going to make sure those extra checks are done, those type of things in a competitive environment? You're going to have nicer vehicles because you want to be able to pick, do I want to ride in this type of vehicle? Might be some of the considerations there. When we talk about life cycle now, there's the 5 phases, and there will be a question. Again, there's a list of 5, right? Anything on the list, and so there's the conceptual phase, and that's determining what types of motor vehicles will meet the organization's needs. And that's going to be based upon the environment, all the things we already discussed. What's the purpose, what environment, the physical conditions. We're going to start thinking, okay, we need to have a truck that has autonomy liftgate and has to have these type of things as part of our fleet operations. The engineering phase is selecting the types of vehicles, operators, routes, roads, schedules, and maintenance that best meets the organization's fleet needs. And so, so now we're looking, okay, not only, from the operating capacity, if we have a certain type of vehicle, does it require a commercial driver's license? Does it require extra training? How difficult is it to maintain those type of vehicles? And again, I'd probably, let's think about Southwest, and we start looking at this from a conceptual phase. They say we want to fly aircraft, and we want to fly them, and they're mainly going to be short haul type of flights. They're not going to be long, probably 2 to 3 hours, no more than 5. So we need an aircraft that's going to meet these type of needs. Then we start saying, okay, well, the 737 probably meets some of those because we're planning on having, to be economically feasible. How many people do we have to fly? What's the economic conditions with fuel prices? Hey, if we only have one type of aircraft instead of doing multiple types, guess what? We only have to have pilots that all of them could fly this plane now. We don't have to worry about what their certifications are. From a maintenance standpoint, we can make sure we have plenty of the right parts on hand for that for that aircraft. It'll work with our routing based upon what we said, our short thing, and then also the schedules, the ability to maybe turn those, the planes around fairly quickly. So we have to put new chairs, or new seats, those type of things. We can say, hey, we're not having to have a whole inventory of supplies to now support our operations. Then we go to production phase, which is now, well, we're going to purchase the vehicles that were selected in the conceptual and engineering phases. And then operational, well, that's exactly it. We're going to use them. Using the vehicles selected to transport the freight, things like that. And then finally, the last thing is the disposal phase. Eliminate old vehicles unable to legally fulfill the purposes and attributes of the fleet because of age, technological obsolescence, or other reasons. One of the big reasons that I've seen, I've done risk assessments and things at cities, is that you'll see fire trucks aren't cheap, and they'll keep on working on these fire trucks and spend. It's always down, and they're going to spend more money on maintenance at some point. And it's worth just buying a vehicle. If you think of, I'll kind of turn this around, and we're talking about fleets, but let's talk about computers. Okay, what type of computer does an office need? What type of think of, again, from a systems approach. Well, we need these 3 types of computers. We need laptops, we need PCs. Okay, how often are we going to, what type of hard drive? Those type of things based upon the need. Are we doing high-end graphics? How much storage capacity is the person traveling a lot? So I want something more rugged. All these engineering, hopefully you're starting to see how the systems approach applies to a whole bunch of other aspects. And then on the disposal phase or operational, one of the things that you see is done, which I think was a great idea, should have been a long time ago, is that basically every 3 years we're cycling out. We have a replacement schedule for computers. Part of the reason is the warranties run out, and once the warranties run out, it's going to cost us more. It'll be cheaper for us to more likely purchase a newer computer than it would be continually maintaining it. So that's really a part of it, building in that schedule of replacement. So the final component of that is systems and relationships. So most systems need to be nested, as it talks about, within other systems, so that smaller systems, which are components of large systems, and large systems consist of smaller subsystems. So basically the idea is that if you have a smaller systems that fail, if it's nested in there, it becomes more likely that each of the larger systems of which the smaller system is part of will also fail. So we kind of mentioned, if you start seeing the oil light come on your car, okay, that's an indication. That's part of the subsystem, if we start seeing failure there. Or if we start seeing, okay, the tires are going bald on the car. Well, at some point, you're going to have a catastrophic failure of a blowout. So you kind of get indications that even these smaller systems start failing. It can have, it's such a core element of the system, it can bring down the whole system. The failure of a larger system degrades the environment in which the subsystems operate, and increasing the strain on those subsystems and making their failures more likely. So really, again, all these things really work together. If we have road closures, that might be a failure of, when we talk about the system, the environment, the physical environment of routes, that if there's 2 ways to get to Lake Tahoe from Sacramento, Highway 50 and Highway 80. If Highway 50, which always has, mudslides at some point, then you got to go Highway 80. But if both of them are closed, how do you get product? So again, those are the types of considerations that people think of backup plans as part of that. So now we go into the next part of vehicle selection. So vehicles selected should be selected with safety in mind, that are suitable for the tasks they have been chosen to perform. They should have a good safety record, easy to maintain, and are reasonably uniform within the fleet. And again, Southwest, the more uniform it is, the easier it's going to be able to maintain. You got to make sure that the types of vehicles, if you have diesel and gasoline, well, you got to make sure if you're doing maintenance and you have your own fleet, do you have, so can the guys even work on those? Are they certified to be able to work on the diesel engine? Are they qualified to be able to do that? So this means the greater the probability the driver can operate any of the vehicles with equal safety, knowledge, and confidence. Another good example, the story of when I had to go to Point Arena, which is near the northern coast, and I had to go. There's only it's a very small town, only has 2 employees, and the one gentleman was driving the truck, and I had to go to the sewer plant, and truck they selected, it's a stick shift. the guy can't drive a stick shift. But he tried, and we're driving around, and so that is a risk, so why would you drive? I mean, I don't know why anyone, from a selection standpoint, because not everyone can drive a stick shift, everyone's so used to automatic, that from a fleet standpoint, you would probably rarely ever choose a manual transmission when over that, just because you're limiting the type of people that could drive, and you didn't necessarily hire the person for the driving capability it was to maintain the water treatment plant. The safety equipment considerations, solid body construction, high maneuverability. The reality is nowadays, where you had a lot of concerns about safety equipment, airbags, it's pretty much all standard. You're not going to find a vehicle, for the most part, that doesn't have, for the most part, most safety equipment on it. The only difference might be is if you're going to be driving more in the snow, does it have some other type of accessories, like I mentioned, the snow tire type thing, to where where the chains are automatically deployed when driving. So we're going to switch gears here. So we talked a little bit about the environment and the systems approach to that. Now we're going to talk a little bit more on the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, so FMCSR. And you will have some type of question that deals with this. Basically, the idea is, the Motor Carrier Safety Regulations is probably, whether you memorize the acronym, where the rules apply, and they use more technical lingo about gross vehicular weight, but I'm going to try to make it a little bit easier for you. The main considerations you have here is, when you're looking at gross vehicular weight of 26,000, you're talking about a tractor trailer. Okay, these are vehicles which require commercial driver's license. All right. So if you're driving, a tractor trailer, so that's going to be easily over 26,000 pounds, or 26,000 pounds, including any towed vehicle exceeding 10,000 pounds. So again, you're talking tractor trailer again, because you're also towing now as well. Transporting 16 or more people, including the driver. Okay, make it easier. They're talking 15 passenger vans. All right, which are the worst invention that is ever out there. And anyone that has 15 passenger vans should be getting rid of them as soon as possible. Unfortunately, a lot of universities have 15 passenger vans. The thing is if you have a 15 passenger van, even if you take the seats out, it's still a 15 passenger van and requires a commercial endorsement. And that's probably the one thing. There's more deaths of university students every year from people driving. Every year you're going to hear about a story of someone driving too fast and rolling over. I think there's one in Washington about 2 years ago. Or church, they buy these things, and they're just not stable. They don't take corners very well. So from a risk management standpoint, that's why the recommendation is you buy a 12-passenger van. You never buy a 15-passenger, because as soon as you buy the 15-passenger, that driver now has to have a commercial driver's license. It doesn't matter how many people are in the van. Once you do that, it requires that. The other requirement is transporting hazardous materials. So typically, there'll be obviously a tractor trailer in most cases, but anytime you might see the vehicles that are air gas or some others that they'll have, those require what they call a hazardous materials endorsement, which we'll talk more about. Basically means they have to have background checks, they have to have other types of things to be even allowed to be able to drive those. And then also there's typically with a driver's license, driving a bus or other type of commercial vehicle, it'll require a commercial driver's license, plus it'll be what they call passenger endorsement or hazardous materials endorsement. So they kind of talk a little bit about that book, but they don't go into detail. So again, if you keep in context, they give all these things. When you think about it, when you're on the exam, just think, okay, what type of vehicles are we talking about, and then put that into the category of what it most likely would be. There are exemptions, typically for taxis, school buses, and van pools. In those regards, they have different rules. They fall under different regulations. Not that they don't apply to them, but taxis and livery, all those are covered under the Public Utilities Commission in California, and they have specific requirements. But there is no background check requirements for taxi drivers. There's no anything like that. Whereas, or drug testing, excuse me, for some of these other types of things.
So if you have a 15-seat vehicle in your van pool?
If you have a 15-seat
vehicle and it's a part of your van.
Surplus it.
I mean, do you still need to require it?
If anyone, whoever drives it. So the question is, if you have a 15-passenger van and it's in your van pool, whoever drives it has to have a commercial driver's license. So if they don't have it, and that becomes the issue, is if they're driving it and they don't have the CDL to drive it, then you're in bigger trouble if something happens.
So what about the exception for van pools?
So van pools, most of the van pools, because most of the van pools aren't 15-passenger vans, they're 12-passenger. And so there's not really an exemption. I mean, so the 15-passenger van rule will still apply, but it's saying if you have a van pool, because the idea is you're carrying passengers, and even though you're not, so they come under different regulations, but you don't have to have the commercial driver's license. I could drive a van in a van pool, but if it was a 15-passenger van, I would have to have a commercial driver's license in order to drive that van. So some of the significant rules that are part of it, and these are some that you will go in a little more detail, but I think it's important to note. We do have a question here. Hazmat, I think it's okay. So Bob asked a question or a comment that it's only if it's placard quantities, and correct. And so it's not. So on the hazardous materials, the kind of what I talked about before is that if you're transporting hazardous materials, you'd have to have a commercial driver's license. So it does say it's subject to certain types of materials. So if it's placard required, and it does talk about that. But in general, they're not going to go that specific, and they're saying what kind of placard, but they're going to talk about hazardous materials on the exam because they're not. There's a whole list of all these things that would be considered under appendix that you'd have to look up, and that's not going to be part of the exam. So some of the regulations or rules that apply for those that fall under the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. So there's going to be driver qualification requirements. And sometimes it might be a medical exam might be part of the qualifications. It'll be typically there's part of the qualifications is you have to pull their motor vehicle record. They also have to be enrolled in the DMV Employer Pull Notice Program, which means anytime there's activity in the driving record, whether it be their own vehicle or someone else, you'll get notified. And then and the next piece that kind of goes with it is drug testing for employees who perform safety-sensitive functions. Typically, there's random drug testing requirements. So if you hear about people big rigs, did they do the drug testing appropriately? That'll be part of it. There's also there's random drug testing, and then there's basically post-accident requirements. So if they're in an accident, they're required to take a drug test. If they refuse to, they're deemed to fail, and basically they'll lose their driver's license because of that. Hours of service rules. There's certain requirements that you can't drive more than a certain amount of hours. You have to have a certain amount of hours of rest, and that's usually with one employer. Where it kind of gets difficult is there's people that moonlight. They work for a transit company, and then they moonlight work for a charter company. It's a different employer. Technically, they're supposed to keep track of both of their logs to have those hours of rest, but that can become an issue. Accident reporting rules are required to report accidents to the employer within a certain time frame. There's some record-keeping rules, electronic device usage rules. Just like on trains and other things, we heard about the metro in LA. The person was on their cell phone or texting. Well, under this rule, basically it bans any type of use of electronic devices as part of that. And then finally, compliance, safety, and accountability programs. So under driver qualifications, one of the main things is you have to have a commercial driver's license, and also establishes penalties and disqualification terms for commercial operators convicted of certain criminal offenses and serious traffic violations. Basically, if you have a DUI within a certain time frame, you lose your driver's license, your CDL, and one, you're not going to get hired, and you won't have that ability to do that. The other thing that's important to note is that the blood alcohol level is lower for commercial driver's license. Typically in California it's 0.08. I want to say it's 0.04. I'm pretty sure. And so, if you're even off hours and you have a certain level, you can basically lose your license on that. And I know several folks, they're very, because they're one thing that they use in here, they talk about driver qualifications, They used to call them operator qualifications, and I think that's actually a more accurate term. I can tell you right now, if you call someone a bus driver, they don't like it. They're bus operators. And if you think about heavy equipment operators or other ones, they're operating a huge piece of equipment, and there's lots of things that go on, and they're not just driving. And so that's one of my kind of issues I do have when they call them driver qualifications. Also, the DMV Employer Pull Notice Program is a mandatory enrollment, and they must provide employer notice of motor vehicle violations upon hire and annually thereafter. Now, technology-wise, one of the things that we use as part of this, a lot of, at least California, they have it. We use what's called Samba Fleet Watch, and in California, they've gone away from snail mail where things are emailed. But this will actually track employees. You'll get emails when an employee does have an alert, basically, which they have an activity on their record, and it'll actually decode what those moving violations are, so you can see if it's a DUI, things like that. So it helps keeps much better control to determine that. The other thing is also you're able to track. It's just as important to know when people are having accidents when they're driving their own vehicle, and because if they're driving your vehicle and they have 3 points and they get an accident or something else or DUI, the people that go for the deep pockets, and in this case, the university gets sued because we have someone that probably shouldn't be driving one of our vehicles. One thing to note, just as again, this is not something that's going to be on the exam, but I think it's important to know, is that talking on a cell phone or texting is not considered a moving violation. It is a non-point violation. So people can get as many of those and pay all the fines, which I believe, distracted driving, that does lead to that, but it's not going to reflect on the driving record as a point violation. And there's certain criteria that essentially after 4 points you get your license suspended. If you get 4 points within 1 year, 6 within 2, or I can't remember exactly, but there's certain things. And the point violations, when you look at what a 2-point violation is, excessive speeding, over 100 miles an hour, hit and run. I mean, the 2-point violations are pretty serious. They're not minor things. The other thing under commercial driver's license, not mentioned in here, is that whatever the violation normally is, multiplied by 1.5. So that's California. That's how many points that they get charged with under commercial by having a commercial driver's license, whether they're driving, in private or actually doing the business. So drug testing. The regulation requires compliance with the Department of Transportation requirements in drug and alcohol testing for drivers who are required to hold a commercial driver's license. You cannot drive within 4 hours of drinking alcohol. And if they do it, the test, I think, is, down below it talks about positive tests is anything above 0.02 or higher, and must be removed from a safety-sensitive duties for 24 hours. So so it's at 0.04, it's 0.02. So basically, if under a random test and that person gets pulled that day, and they find that they have some alcohol in their body, basically they cannot drive for 24 hours. Just so people on airlines, they call it 8 hours throttle to bottle to throttle, the other way around. Same kind of idea. Cannot refuse to submit to alcohol test or use within 8 hours after an accident or before post-accident testing. Again, they're going to do those testing for those type of reasons. And you see the other reasons why they can perform tests for pre-employment, random, reasonable suspicion. So whereas if you look like someone's not walking right, those type of things, you can have certain criteria to say, not even random. Under those criteria, you can say, no, you're going to go take a drug test or a breathalyzer or something like that. And this is not something that the union might be able to agree with, or Teamsters, other type of things. But traditionally, on these, there's pretty specific criteria. What you have to have one person that knows that, you have to say, hey, can you look? Do you agree that this person's doesn't look right? As long as you get 2 managers to agree that that doesn't look right, then usually that's kind of that's protection that's put in place when you start doing reasonable suspicion or reasonable cause to do a drug test. And then return to duty, someone that's been off work at some point for like an accident, something like that, you're going to have them do return to duty or some type of follow-up. Hours of service rules. So I just took this directly out of here. You're probably not going to have too specific a question on hours of service rules. And hours of service rules, talks about for a driver that is carrying property, no passengers, no hazardous materials, it works for a carrier that operates 6 days per week, include these type of requirements. Following a minimum 10-hour off-duty break, the driver may only drive for an 11-hour period. So when you see all those trucks that are on the side of the road where they're sleeping in the cabs, this is the reason why. They can only drive so much during a certain time period. When we talk about technology, I think it's called a codec machine. At least Raley's had them on their trucks. It actually monitored how long the person's been driving, monitored a lot of things, idling time, things like that. But it also monitored, it was an electronic register of how long the person was driving. So that way they wouldn't exceed their allowed driving time. The idea being that if someone's driving 12, 13, 14 hours, they're more susceptible to have an accident and cause damage. So that's why they have the hours of service requirement. And that's also sometimes they'll have 2 different people driving. One person drives, but there's a logbook that has to be kept of when they left, when they, how long they've been driving, when they started that. All those type of things are part of the service log. After 8 hours of on-duty time, the driver must take a minimum 30-minute rest break. The driver must not drive a commercial motor vehicle during these breaks. And the driver may not drive beyond the 14th consecutive hour after starting on-duty period that follows a minimum 10-hour off-duty. So basically, if you look at that 24 hours, it's saying within a 24-hour period, you have to have at least 10 hours off. Okay. And then there's different rules for depending on if it's a bus and all this type of stuff. But hours of service is one of the. It's a huge fight between. Usually, well, in some cases, the drivers don't like it because they're, it's based upon how much delivery, how quickly they deliver. There's an incentive, and so they don't necessarily like it because they want to get product, pick up another load, so they can make more money. So it's a productivity issue in many cases of why, whether employers or like it or not like that type of rule. On accident reporting, if an accident occurs in a commercial motor vehicle, you have to report the following: a fatality, bodily injury to a person who immediately receives medical treatment for the injury, or one or more motor vehicles that incur disabling damage as a result. And so there's a whole database that records this type of information. This means you have to report it to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Reg, the DOT or whatever.
I want to ask you, a lot of the regs seem to be geared towards alcohol, with the blood, but
it's drug and alcohol.
Okay, because I saw 60 Minutes again when we were talking about a lot of truckers using methamphetamine to stay awake. I was wondering anyway.
Yeah. So no, they do test when they mentioned blood alcohol, but there is it's driving under the influence, whether it be there's also requirements of the type of medication. So if the prescription, those are the type of things they're worried about too. And so there are some things if they are taking, which I didn't go into, but they're required to be in. If they voluntarily come in, then they can go to a drug treatment, and so there's those type of resources that are provided. On record keeping, DOT required records supporting financial and operational data. So you got to keep your driver's logs, testing data, when the drug testing, the random, all those type of things will have to be kept for a certain amount of time. And they're just looking, if you think, again, common sense, what would you want to keep? A lot of times maintenance records. So for those that have fleet operations, the CHP in California, I think they're called terminal inspections. Essentially, they'll come in, they're going to look at employer pull notice program, what are the maintenance records, that the people all have the commercial driver's license, do they have their medical, have they had their medical within the last 2 years, it hasn't expired. Those are the types of things they're making sure that all the documentation is there, that they have a system in place and they're monitoring those things. It looks like we do have another question here. So the question is all driving safety sensitive, and no. So the safety sensitive positions are typically it's going to be those where you're doing passengers are safety sensitive because like bus drivers are going to be safety sensitive. Hazardous materials are safety sensitive, so there's only a couple. It's those type of things that are considered more safety sensitive in those regards. But it's from a testing standpoint, they're not going to ask you which of these type of things are safety sensitive because there's so many different types of situations which might be deemed safety sensitive depending on what they're moving. Electronic device usage, we kind of touched on this. Devices include cell phone, pagers, computer, or other devices to input or write, send or receive or read text. Now, I'm also I'm part of American Public Transportation, that we have a standards, we're one of the standards approving bodies for transit systems. And one of the committees that I serve on, we actually looked at electronic devices. We actually came up with some of the guidelines that said, because the rules on bus transit didn't apply, or for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations didn't apply to bus transit operations. So they fall under the federal FTA, Federal Transit Administration. And so we helped put those in there. But one of the discussions came up is that if you think about a bus, okay, they're required to make announcements. They've got to take fare. They've got communications. They have communications coming in from dispatch. They have other, there's all these displays that they have to read that says, okay, there's this accident or something. There's a whole bunch of distractions that are electronic devices that are what we call not operator controlled, that the organization has now put in place. And there's more and more devices coming. You look at, if you ride a public bus anymore, you'll see that there's just tons of stuff. There's all this equipment around them, and there's that concern is that they are now becoming distracted by all this equipment, that they're now being required to do all these different activities. Again, that's the reason why they're not drivers, they're operators, because they are doing some of these different activities. And then the last part of this is the Compliance with Safety and Accountability Program, CSA, and the idea behind this is that as part of this is kind of like the terminal inspection that CHP might do, is they're essentially going to develop a score based upon unsafe driving, hours of service, and they're going to look at the whole program and provide the operation some type of fleet safety score with this. And using the various technology, I wouldn't expect a whole lot. There's not going to ask for the details, but the idea is what are those elements that constitute or the main provisions of the Federal Motor Carrier Act. That's what you want to know. And then there might be some specific things more on hours of service or things you might want to be concerned about. Again, 50,000-foot level, what are the things you're concerned about if you have a fleet operation? What are the considerations that you might have given a certain type of scenario that they'll give you? So now we're going to talk about controlling the losses. So now that we have a fleet, we've got our system, now what are we going to do from a loss control or risk control standpoint to try to handle some of that? So if we think about the main components of the safety system, we're going to, the vehicles, vehicle maintenance, drivers, cargoes, routes, and vehicle schedules. So we're going to go a little bit more on what can we actually do when we look at that. So on a vehicle standpoint, fleet safety is going to be influenced by the selection of the task-appropriate vehicles. Establishes safe operating practices and vehicle maintenance and replacement. So we're going to kind of go a little more detail in each one of these. So, and I kind of put, although not a vehicle operation, a Southwest an example of a system that considers these elements. Only one type of aircraft makes training more standard and maintenance easier. So if you're going to choose a vehicle, you're going to have standard operating procedures. What's the checklist? What's the inspection? Does your organization require that an inspection be conducted before a pool vehicle be checked out? You're going to have guidelines. Are people, the rules are no cell phone usage. What are some of the not speeding? Some vehicles, they actually have they have tracking devices that can determine, like on big rigs, if they can only go a certain amount of time, it'll give a warning that they can only be going maybe over the speed limit for less than 30 seconds. Otherwise, the signal goes to dispatch, letting them know that the person's speeding. So there are certain things, devices that can be put on there to recognize when people are doing certain types of activities. So when we look at vehicle selection, some of the considerations that we want to look at is think about the cargo that's going to be carried, or whether it be passengers. So if I'm a nursing home and I'm going to have shuttle buses, okay, well, the type of shuttle bus I select is going to be different if I had a bunch of school kids, right? Because most likely for that transport, I'm going to make sure it has a wheelchair lift. I'm going to have, or has more space for maybe assisted, lifting, something like that. School buses, they're not, regular school buses aren't required to have a wheelchair lift, but they'll have a bus that can, based on that route, will then go specifically to pick up that child. Some of the factors you want to consider: cargo, size, and type. What are you going to be carrying? Characteristics of a load. the load shift, the flammable, or for refrigeration. So that has to be consideration. Number of passengers. So how big of a vehicle are we going to get? We're going to get a small, short shuttle bus. We're going to get a 50-plus passenger bus for transportation. Where are we going to operate? Geographic area. Highways, mountains, deserts, windy roads. So for campuses, I'll use this. So Santa Cruz, they, they've had their fleet operations, and which is not mentioned here, bus stop selection. So if anyone that goes to the UC Santa Cruz campus, one of the challenges that campus has grown quite a bit, and originally they had the short buses. Well, they have so many passengers, they need the bigger buses. Well, the bus stops aren't designed for the bigger buses, and so it creates issues of trying to pull in and pull out. So that can be the geographic operation where you're just going around a small campus, but you have challenges now that you're going to have to deal with that. Other safety considerations, and as well as you have to keep in consideration how easy is that vehicle to maintain. So just like my wife and I are looking for a car, so some of the things that we look at is, okay, well, we look at obviously the price, safety considerations, we look at those things. Well, the other part is, well, how much does it replace a car part on just on a Volvo or a BMW, and then you find your Lexus, and you kind of find out, well, you mean a mirror costs $500? No, forget it. If I can't do the maintenance or those type of things, then you start looking at, okay, it's too expensive to maintain. I'm going to look at something else maybe. But all those, or some other considerations. My wife has to have Bluetooth, and seat warmers. So that's a whole other story. Won't go there. So every car we look at doesn't have seat warmers. We move to the next one. So safety equipment. Most vehicles, like I said, have standard equipment, but you might have specialized equipment that you need to consider. Air brakes might be something. Now, air brakes operate a little differently than regular brakes, and so people have to know how to, so it requires, let's say, special training, but it takes a little, it's a little different process. Well, backup signals, maybe rock guards. Are you going to have to put all some of these things? So the idea of rock guards is if you don't want to pay for a whole bunch of chipped windows that, from people behind you calling up and saying, hey, you just spit a rock. If you don't have those, then you're more likely you're going to get claims. So those are the type of accessories you might want to think about. Then also vehicle replacement. Replacement schedule be developed with funding mechanism based on miles or years of service. There's some vehicles can last a long time. You don't drive that often. You can have a vehicle for 20 years, and just because of mileage, so you replace it because of the mileage, not because of the years that it's been in there. In other ones, you're going to typically a bus in San Francisco, or typically a bus in general for transit purposes, 6 years is probably the average lifespan of a public transit bus. And those buses are about $80,000 to $100,000 a piece, if not more than that. So you got to have that replacement schedule for that fleet. And also, when you do vehicle replacement, then provides an opportunity to maybe look at better equipment, what's new that's out there, newer technology. And I mentioned, I use like the school bus replacement. I keep on harping on about our school district. Because of changes in technology, we had to have basically for clean air, we couldn't do modifications, so we did have to buy a new bus. But that should be part of the replacement schedule. Someone knew about the rules 3 or 4 years ago. It should have planned for that, saying we need to start budgeting money now for that type of replacement. Vehicle maintenance affects fleet losses 2 ways. Proper maintenance tends to improve safety records and reduce losses, and the maintenance can be a hazardous operation and must itself be performed. So the idea that obviously preventive maintenance, but on the maintenance of the vehicles, what I can tell you is that people working on Toyotas get the most injuries because they have more sharp corners than any other vehicle. And so people that work on, I worked with dealerships at one point. That was one of the big issues, is that they're not the most ergonomic for maintenance folks to be able to access what they need to in many cases. So we talked about preventive maintenance. Must be done on a scheduled basis, even though no mechanical problems are apparent, and that's key to safe, reliable. So every 3,000 or 4,000, whatever, 5,000 miles, you're going to rotate the tires. I mean, especially, it's one thing if it's your own vehicle and you want to take the chance. It's another thing when you're out transporting kids or other things. There's got to be a regular maintenance schedule so it doesn't break down, especially if it's part of your revenue-generating operations as well. It's even more important that that happens. helps keep accidents from happening, enables vehicle to complete trips on time without breaking down, as I said, provided that every vehicle in the fleet has time to reach and stay at a proper maintenance facility. And the challenge is, do you have, so if if you don't have an extra bus or an extra vehicle, it's going to be more difficult to not, how are you going to rotate those vehicles out on a regular basis? All right. Other issues on safety standpoint, I'm not going to go in detail here, but there's a lot of things that can happen in a fleet shop if they're going to do it in-house. That's part of the consideration is, are you going to do your own maintenance, or are you going to go and contract out for that maintenance? Drivers. Now we get to probably one of my more favorite subjects is it's just important you select the vehicles. That's part of your system, right? Now, what about the drivers that are going to operate within that system? So driver selection is a huge part of that process and involves training, and we'll go through each one of these. So driver selection, essential steps in selecting new drivers for any motor vehicle include these: analyzing the job functions. What are the tasks that will have to be performed by the driver? Okay, so one of the things that for buses, so for public transportation buses, they actually have, because it's more of a flat wheel design. It's not, a vertical. And so can someone actually reach and turn the wheel appropriately? Because one of the challenges, if you kind of, with the honeymooners, bigger, sometimes you have a little bigger guys and women that are driving the buses. And if they can't turn the wheel, that becomes an issue. If it gets on their, the stomach as they do it, that becomes an issue. The other huge issue is that they need to be able to actually look over the window area to see if, so they actually set up some of the criteria from a physical ability. Can they see over the window if someone's walking in front? Because if they can't, they can only get up a certain, can their feet reach the pedals? These are issues.
And another thing with the pedals is the force that they need to exert to press the pedals. And because we've seen a couple of claims where, female driver, she had an injury, but part of her coming back, the accommodations process was, can she, press the pedals and do the pre-flight, not pre-flight, pre-driver's checks that they're required to do, which,
So yeah, so all those things come into account. Or if you're operating a paratransit, or if you're again a public bus, they'll have the lift for be able to secure. They'll be able to demonstrate that secure the wheelchair. So there's all these physical abilities that go with it. So you got to think about what is a person doing if they're transporting material, using a pallet jack. All those different things has to be part of the task of the observations of who you're going to select. It's not just enough about do they have a clean driving record. That's important, but there's the other part too. Recruiting the applicants, advertising, pre-screening, and reviewing the applicants. When we do the screening, interviewing, administering written and road tests, a lot of times people do the written tests, but they don't do a road test with them to make sure that, and it's not just one road test. You want to go longer. If they're operating, $80,000 piece of machinery for you, you want to make sure that they really are good drivers and spend some time with them. Hiring employees, making the initial job offer, subject to checks and physical exam, conducting background checks, conducting a physical examination, and then confirming the job offer, and then finally orienting the employees, conducting new employee orientations, and establishing and maintaining the qualification file. So that's part of the, and part of that is going to be a motor vehicle record check. You want to make that determination that that they don't have too many points and things like that. So this is something that was in the book. They talk about having criteria. One of the biggest challenges I can tell you for any organization is they don't have criteria of what constitutes a person that's qualified, or what's an acceptable driving record. Okay, that's probably the best way to put it. What that means is that how many points is acceptable? Just because UC policy at this point is as long as you have a valid driver's license, you can drive a UC vehicle. Now that means you could have had a DUI and you got it back. And this is for most organizations. That at some point, at what point do you say, something? You got 3 points. I'm sorry, you can't drive one of our vehicles. And that's a battle that a lot of organizations face of what is considered acceptable. Now it's just points, but then there's also the consideration here that we talk about at-fault accidents. There's also people that drive and back into things and break whatever, and it's not a point violation from DMV standpoint, but they keep on causing a lot of costly things, and so that might be an at-fault accident might be part of that. And so here's some criteria that they kind of said, hey, if you've had, an at-fault, a moving violation, 2 moving violations, and no at-fault accidents, that you still, might be able to, drive for us. But if you have 2 moving violations and 2 at-faults, then that becomes an issue. And you kind of see the criteria. This is by no means the end-all, be-all. This is just one example of what might be considered for an acceptable driving record. But that it's probably the missing link in almost every driver selection policy, or not so much the selection. It's after they're hired. How do you remove someone to say you can no longer drive is probably the bigger issue that I see. Driver training may involve classroom training behind the wheel, teaching, independent study in various ways, textbooks. My daughter turned 16 in October, so I'm very big on the driver training aspect at this point. And so she actually did an online course, did all that kind of the driver safety portion online, and now she gets to do the behind the wheel. And so there's a lot of different systems. There's a Smith system that's out there where you do observations. National Safety Council has DDC-4, which is called Defensive Driving 4, which is a 4-hour class. And some of these can also help reduce insurance costs by doing that. So, but they should, vehicle operators should be trained in the following areas: traffic law, safety features, how to, cargo characteristics, how it might handle, what they're doing. So if people do have 15-passenger vans or even 12-passenger vans, I would want them to know how the driving characteristics are different in this van compared to driving their Miata. It's, because of center of gravity issues, they need to know how they want to, store if they're going to have material in the back, that's heavy. How does that affect the driving characteristics? Defensive driving, first aid procedures, safety inspection. And then also at some point, driver training might, if they did get an accident, or you do refresher training at some point. So that'll be part of that consideration as well. On the supervision area, purposes to motivate drivers to act in the best interest of the organization by operating their vehicle safely and cost-effective. They can do this by efficient operator behavior and discouraging, disciplining unsafe, ineffective behavior. The challenge is, how can the driver do that? Or how can a supervisor do that if they're not with them all the time to know what they're doing? It's only after an accident occurs. So we'll talk more about some of the technology, but there's people may have seen on 60 Minutes or other shows something called DriveCam or Smart Drive. Some insurance companies now will provide these cameras for free to those that have teenage drivers, so maybe I'll look into that. And essentially what it is, it's a camera that goes it's basically in the windshield. It logs into the onboard computer of the vehicle, and it has a camera that looks inside and camera outside, and it has a G-force detector, and it's always kind of on, but it only records 30 seconds prior to an incident occurring and 30 seconds after. And the idea behind it is that you'll see what the person was doing right up that led to the accident and what they did afterwards. Or it doesn't have to be an accident. It could be that they slammed on the brakes real hard. The G-force effect will do that. And because it's tied to the onboard computer, it'll say, here's the speed that they're going, here's the G-forces that they generated. So you can see, or if you can even have it set on speed indication, that will automatically start recording. Once they go past 65 miles an hour, they'll record, and then that way you can see what they're doing. What the results were from seeing the videos on these is you can see people talking, 65, talking on a cell phone, driving with their knee while they're eating cereal, all these other things, and that really gives now supervisors a means to correct behavior. So it's like the Hawthorne effect. What you can actually be there and then typically see people drive better. Most airports, Sacramento Airport I know has these, and most other taxi cabs in I think Las Vegas now have the cameras, because it's also a security issue. They can punch the thing and then also record if they have issues in the vehicle as well. So that's one good way to use technology to advantage it. And then where lack of supervision is a fact, some organizations compensate with procedural or physical controls, such as written logs. Dispatchers watch and listen for incidents, so they might be monitoring the radio. There might be some other ways to do that. There's also GPS that can be part of this camera system as well, and you can find out if people have gone off route. Okay, so it'll actually be the same thing that the insurance companies, if you say that the people are not allowed to go out this jurisdiction, if that, you can actually get an email from the company says, hey, your daughter's now gone, outside the boundary area, then you can also get notified that way. Driver licensing. So failure to conform, confirm that drivers have current valid license and expose the organization to liability. Again, this is where some states have relatively liberal standards for licensing drivers, so it's important to make sure that they're actually competent to be able to drive the vehicles. Just as I said, that hey, just because they have a commercial or regular driver's license, doesn't have to be commercial, but driving a fleet maintenance vehicle and it's a stick or whatever, doesn't mean that they know how to drive that vehicle safely. And then just be aware of other types of requirements that transport hazardous materials, of fuels, chemicals, and waste. There might be some other restrictions. From a dismissal standpoint, each dismissal or replacement of a vehicle driver should raise or at least maintain the overall level of safety in the fleet. So it depends on what you're dismissing the person for. But before a driver is dismissed because of a poor safety record, the employer should confirm that the driver's deficiencies have been the predominant cause of the poor record, and that those deficiencies cannot be corrected. So the idea is to hopefully, one and gone. There are some firms, I'm going to say Schneider Trucking. It's one and gone. If you have an incident, you're fired. They're very strict on their policy there.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things, and one of the cities I worked in, it's a part of your job requirement. It's stated in your job description. So you can't, if you're a driver and you can't drive because you have a suspended license for 6 months, whatever, that's another form of dismissal. And that's correct. And so one of the things that we're looking at, we actually have a vehicle selection policy that we drafted that goes beyond. So we have acceptable driving criteria that we're trying to push through. And that was one of the considerations is that, well, if someone can't drive, then that may mean they're dismissed if it's a core function. It depends if it's a core function, but if they don't have a driver's license, they can't drive. What are they going to do? And that's a core responsibility. If someone else can drive, then that becomes some of the other issues. And the dismissal or replacement should not have an overly adverse effect on the safety performance or conduct of the remaining driver. So the idea is just be cognizant of that you're just not willing just automatically getting rid, but you have to have procedures in place to allow to try to correct conditions as much. You want to try to identify them, and that's where the DriveCam Smart Drive are really good, because you're really trying to identify bad behaviors before an accident occurs, because usually by the time you get time to correct it, it's too late otherwise. So when we talk now, so we did the vehicles, we talked about drivers, now we're talking about cargoes. So things we need to make sure is suitability to the vehicle, proper loading, and suitability to routes, as well as safeguards against inherent bias. So we talked about what these things are. So suitability to the vehicle. Cargo has got to be suitable to a vehicle. Only, and this is where this is the language they use. Cargo is suitable to a vehicle only if the vehicle possesses no unreasonable hazard to the cargo, and the cargo poses no unreasonable hazards to the vehicle. The idea is that you want to make sure that what you're putting in, the vehicle is not going to harm the vehicle because of the material that you're transporting, as well as vice versa. So I'm trying to think of some different issues. Gasoline.
Yeah, gas. Yeah. So yeah, if you don't want to be carrying. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, you want to make sure that you have. Well, this is probably a good one. Suitability. Okay, you don't want to put dry ice in the back of your trunk of a car. Okay. Okay, so dry ice off gases, and basically you want to keep the windows open. So basically you're going to get oxygen deficiency if you had dry ice. So one of the things that I used to work when I was working, Raley's, we had stores in New Mexico. The transporter actually didn't have refrigerated trucks. They used dry ice in the back, and that's how they kept the product cool in the trailer. Well, you got to open those doors, and your procedures are you got to give time, because if you walk right in there, you're just going to fall basically down, because you're not going to have any air to breathe, depending on how long the haul was. So that might be an example. It's not. It's part of it. Proper loading, potential to overload or not properly secure cargo can lead to serious losses, both of product and damage to the vehicle. And if nothing else, think of when you hear about ladders in the road. That might be an example, because people didn't secure it properly. As well as then you have other potential loads. 15-passenger vans not being loaded properly can cause, it's going to be more likely to turn over. Suitability of the routes. Certain cargo, if you're going to be, turns, things like that, where it's more likely to fall over, that might be part of it. The example they gave in the book is, going through the desert, with a refrigerated truck that may not have, if it's not properly there, or if you have cargo, there's certain cargo that may, you can't take cargo, hazardous materials on certain things, like on mini bridges or tunnels. So your route's got to be specific. You got to know what route you can take based upon what cargo you're carrying as well. And then inherent vice is a condition that can cause property to deteriorate or destroy itself. Some cargoes tend to destroy themselves if not kept in a controlled environment, which must always be functioning and properly maintained. And that's actually the refrigeration issue, probably more so. Routes. So routes suitably safe, cost-effective, reliable routes are those that present no unacceptable hazards to vehicles, drivers, and cargoes. Okay? Think ice road trucking, right? Or what's the other one? The ice road trucking, or whatever, Peru, or whatever. They did that, and you want to think about the type of roads. The good news is, for the most part, in the U.S., we have decent roads, but some of the routes, again, some bridges, maybe they're one way. Can they handle the loads? There's some where they have lower bridges or overpasses where, depending on the size of the cargo, they may not be able to get through. So that's what we're talking about there. Reasonable distance. Distance is a very important factor. The less distance a vehicle, its cargo and operator have to travel on the road, the less likely they'll have to incur a loss. So you try to do more short haul, or you have people that are specific to the operations. Typically, Raley's Distribution Center, they had more short haul. They did to the stores. They had a main distribution that had like the bigger loads, the different types of vehicles. Raley's actually at one point had LNG trucks. LNG trucks are really good from an environmental standpoint, liquid natural gas, but basically they can only operate in the Sacramento areas. You can't take those to go over the mountains. Not only that, because you have fuel to fill up once you're over the mountains. So the capacity of how far they could go before refueling becomes also the reasonable distance issue on the routes. And offer some flexibility of all for close. They gave the example of going over the Sierras, going to Lake Tahoe. You got to make sure that you have routes that you're going to have. The vehicles that you have are going to be able to make those routes, if you have to use the alternative in that event. Vehicle schedules, sound schedules oriented, safety-oriented schedule provides enough time for vehicle operators to complete their trips on schedule without rushing and without becoming involved in scheduling conflicts. Okay, so the idea of, okay, I've got to make my next stop. This is an issue where bus drivers or others, or you look at those that are driving product from one place to another. They make money based on how quickly they meet those deadlines to get product there, and so that becomes part of it. Making sure that you're not rushing people so much that they're going to speed or do things that are more dangerous. Incentive programs also include incentives for safety-related conduct. Otherwise, such programs tend to jeopardize safety because operators may be tempted to speed, drive too many hours, skip scheduled maintenance, or safety checks. So usually you got to temper those programs and say, but you also have to do it within these parameters to make that happen. And now technological advances. So we're near the end here. So the technological advances, onboard computers can capture information about risky driving behavior and allow a risk manager to evaluate operator performance before an accident. So some of the technologies, there's stability control systems. We see those, just on regular vehicles, some of the things we're talking about, rear-mounted videos, so you can see when you're backing up, what's behind you. Anti-lock braking, onboard tire inflation systems, satellite communication GPS systems, dash-mounted video cameras, I mentioned DriveCam and Smart Drive, lane departure warning systems. So if you start, falling asleep going into the lane, it'll actually give an indication that you're drifting. So it'll help correct, and forward collision warning system. So as I mentioned, my wife and I were actually looking at cars, and I was surprised that some of these, the forward collision warning, that's a standard item on there. There's another one that had a blind spot indicator. When you turn your turn signal, it'll get a little warning if there's a vehicle that's in the next lane over. And there's a little detector somehow in the mirror that kind of says, hey, there's someone in the blind spot. So there's all these new technologies that are out there that were never there, even 5 years ago, they weren't really those technologies. To be able to really help with some of those different aspects there. And again, whether it's the GPS systems or the other things, there is just a great deal of technology that can be used, and there's always something new that's coming out. The Never Lost, or what's the other one? The GM system, OnStar. Okay, the ability to unlock doors, to do other types of things, depending on what area you're in. So anyways, so I think that's one thing that, from a testing standpoint, there'll probably be something, again, a scenario. What would be some of the considerations you might want to incorporate if you're to have a new fleet? There's going to be something like that where they're going to have questions. Again, the thing is not get too much in the weeds. The goal is to think like a risk manager. If I'm a risk manager, what are the types of things I would want to consider? How do I make things safer? Again, when you think of it as a system, the routes, all those things really, hopefully, you can kind of get the big picture, how all these things really try to come together from that standpoint. So actually, I just repeat on the other one there. So I duplicate there. So that's what we have for tonight. Any questions before we end? And I think we did 2 nights in a row finally where we ended earlier than 7. So we kept a little bit shorter. Once again, the final class, we will be doing a review that will basically a course review, and that we'll see if we'll hopefully be able to end within the normal time frame. Usually that's where I get the most questions, but if you do have questions, please email those questions to me or call me or whatever, and that way I can try to spend a little extra time on those areas that you may have more questions about. Otherwise, everyone have a great evening, and